The window latch gave way with a splintering crack, and Jasper Stone came up out of sleep with his hand already closing around the rifle propped beside his bed, because 11 years of living alone in high country had taught him that a man who wakes slow does not wake again. He was across the cabin in 3 strides, barefoot on the cold plank floor, the Winchester's hammer drawn back before his eyes had even found the shape wedged half through the window frame. What he found stopped him cold. It was not a bear, not a drifter come to rob a trapper's cache, not any of the dozen dangers his mind had already sorted through. It was a woman, her skirts torn at the hem, her dark hair come loose from its pins, one arm reaching past the broken glass toward the shelf where he kept his medicine tin. "Don't shoot," she said, not with fear but with the flat, fast urgency of someone who did not have time to be afraid. "There's a man dying on the creek bank not a quarter-mile from here, and you have carbolic and clean linen on that shelf, and I am going to take them whether you like it or not." Jasper lowered the rifle an inch, though he did not set it down. In the low light through the broken window he could see her clearly now, a young woman, maybe 23 or 24 years, standing on an overturned crate she must have dragged from his woodpile, her hands already bleeding a little from the glass. There was no fear in her face at all, only a fierce, driving purpose that made him lower the rifle the rest of the way without quite deciding to. "Whose man is dying?" he said. His voice came out rough, unused. He had not spoken to another soul in 11 days. "My teamster, Silas Cobb. Our wagon went into Badger Creek trying to ford it and the axle broke and he went under the wheel. His leg is open to the bone and I have nothing to close it with and no water that is not full of silt." She had already gotten the medicine tin into her hands. "I am not a thief, mister, whoever you are. I will pay you for every ounce of this the moment I am able, but I am not going to stand here and argue while a man bleeds to death because you are worried about your window." He should have been angry. Later, thinking back on it, he would wonder why the anger never came, why instead something in his chest had gone very quiet and very attentive, the way it did when he was reading a stretch of river he had never run before and needed to see every current at once. He set the rifle against the wall. "Badger Creek's running high this time of year," he said. "Snowmelt still coming down from the pass. You crossed it in a wagon. We didn't have a choice. The regular ford was washed out below the old cottonwood, and Silas said this one looked calmer. It's not calmer. It's deeper and it hides its rocks better, which is worse." He was already reaching for his boots, for the coil of rope hanging by the door, for the leather satchel where he kept his own field kit, better stocked than the tin she was clutching. "Show me." She did not thank him. She did not waste the breath. She simply turned and half ran, half scrambled back down the slope in the gray pre-dawn light, and Jasper Stone, who had told himself for 11 years that he wanted nothing more to do with saving anyone, found himself running after her. The creek, when they reached it, was a churning brown ribbon swollen far past its banks, throwing up standing waves where it should have run flat and shallow. The wagon lay canted on its side in the shallows near the far bank, one wheel shattered, and a young man no older than 20 lay half in the water and half out of it, his trouser leg soaked black with blood, his face gone the color of old tallow. "Silas." Jane dropped to her knees beside him in the mud without a moment's hesitation, heedless of the water soaking her skirts. "Silas, look at me. I brought help." Jasper was already moving along the bank, his eyes doing the work they had done 10,000 times on 10,000 rivers before this, reading the water, finding the seam where the current slackened, the shelf of gravel just beneath the surface that would hold a man's weight if he stepped exactly right and drown him if he stepped a foot to either side. He had spent the better part of his younger years guiding wealthy men down the Missouri and the Yellowstone in dories, and though he had sworn off that work with a bitterness he did not speak of to strangers, the knowledge in his hands and eyes had never left him. "Stay where you are," he told her. "I'm going to bring him to you. Don't come in after us. He's already bleeding too much to move without. I know how to move an injured man out of moving water, ma'am." I don't expect you know how to keep from being swept into a hole that'll pull you under and hold you there. So stay." There was a beat where she looked as if she might argue anyway, and then, to his surprise, she nodded once, sharply, and stayed. He waded in at the angle he had already worked out, feeling the current's pull increase and then, exactly where he expected, ease as his boot found the gravel shelf. He got his arms under Silas Cobb's shoulders and dragged him back across that same safe seam of water, fighting for balance twice but never losing it, until he could lay the young man on the bank at Jane Ramsey's feet. What happened next surprised him more than the break-in had. She did not scream, did not faint, did not wring her hands. She tore a strip from her own petticoat, wound it above the worst of the wound to slow the bleeding, and then, from a small leather case at her belt that Jasper had not even noticed she carried, produced a needle and a spool of waxed thread. "Hold his leg still," she said. "I have sewn worse than this. My mother taught me to close a wound the same year she taught me to hem a skirt, because out here you never know which skill you will need first." Jasper knelt and held the boy's leg steady while Jane Ramsey, her hands as sure and quick as any surgeon's, closed a gash 4 inches long with neat, even stitches, murmuring low words of comfort to Silas the whole time, her voice gone gentle even as her hands stayed businesslike. Jasper found himself watching her more than the wound, struck by the strange, quiet competence of her, the way courage in her did not look like recklessness but like calm. "You've done this before," he said. "More times than I would like." She tied off the last stitch and reached for the carbolic. "My father ran a trading post at the far side of Maria's Pass. Men came through hurt more often than you would think. I learned to do what needed doing." "Ran," Jasper said, catching the word. "Not runs." Something crossed her face then, quick and sharp as a knife's edge gone before it had fully arrived. "My father died in the spring. I am going to the post now to claim what is mine." She looked up at him for the first time as something other than an obstacle or a set of useful hands. "I am sorry about your window, mister. I still do not know your name." "Jasper Stone. Jane Ramsey." She said it plainly, the way a person says a thing they intend to be believed. "I will pay for the window and the medicine both, Mr. Stone, once the post is mine and turning a profit again. You have my word on that." He looked at her, mud to her elbows, blood on her hands, hair falling loose around a face set with a stubbornness that had nothing soft in it at all, and felt something shift low in his chest that he did not have a name for yet, and would not have trusted if he had. "Keep your money," he said. "Let's get your teamster somewhere dry." It took the better part of that morning to right what could be righted of the wagon, splint Silas Cobb's leg properly, and rig a travois from 2 lodgepole pines and a canvas tarp to haul him the last 6 miles to Ramsey's post, since the wagon itself would need a wheelwright before it moved another foot. Jasper worked alongside Jane without being asked twice, and somewhere in the labor of it, in the way she directed him without ever once ordering him, in the way she thanked him without ever once groveling for his help, he found himself deciding, against every instinct that had kept him solitary for over a decade, to see her the rest of the way to wherever she was going. The post itself, when they finally reached it in the long gold light of late afternoon, sat in a wide notch of the valley where 2 trails crossed on their way toward the pass, a low log building with a sagging porch, a barn gone gray with weather, and a corral with more gaps in its rails than not. A thin, stooped man of perhaps 60 came out onto the porch at the sound of the travois runners scraping gravel, and at the sight of Jane his weathered face went through surprise, relief, and something like grief in the space of a breath. "Miss Ramsey," he said, "Lord above, is it really you? I did not think you would come so soon or so alone." "I am not alone, Mr. Whitfield. Not entirely." She glanced back at Jasper before she could stop herself, and something in the glance made the old clerk's eyebrows lift a fraction. "This is Silas Cobb, my teamster, hurt fording Badger Creek, and this is Mr. Jasper Stone, who saved his life and mine both, whether he will admit to the second part or not." Whitfield helped them settle Silas onto a cot in the storeroom, fussing over him with the particular tenderness of a man long used to caring for whoever came through his door. And then he turned to Jane with the look of a man carrying news he had been dreading to deliver. "Miss Ramsey, I am glad beyond telling that you are here, but I must warn you before you see the ledgers that things are not as your father left them, not by half. Mr. Crane has been managing the accounts since your father passed, as your father's will instructed, and he has told everyone hereabouts that the post is drowning in debt and cannot support itself, let alone support you." "Elias Crane," Jane said, and the name came out of her mouth like something bitter. "My father's oldest friend, his executor. I remember him well enough. He used to bring me peppermint candy from Fort Benton when I was small." "He does not bring candy anymore," Whitfield said quietly. "He brings notices. There is a hearing set for 6 weeks from now, before the circuit judge, on the question of whether you are fit to inherit and manage this post at all. Given your age and his words, not mine, Miss Ramsey, your inexperience in matters of business. If the judge rules against you, the post and everything in it passes into Mr. Crane's guardianship until such time as he judges you competent, which I suspect will be never, because I believe he means to sell the land out from under you the moment he has the right to." Jane's spine went very straight. Jasper, standing in the doorway with his hat in his hands, watched her absorb the blow without flinching, the way she had absorbed the sight of Silas Cobb's opened leg without flinching, and thought again that this was not a woman who broke easily, whatever the world sent at her. "Then I will simply have to prove him wrong," Jane said. "I did not ride 400 miles with everything I own in one trunk to be talked out of what is mine by a man who cannot be bothered to visit in person." She turned then and went to the trunk that Silas's mule had carried, undamaged, through the whole ordeal, and drew out a small wooden box, carved with a plain rose on its lid, worn soft at the corners from years of handling. She opened it with a care that told Jasper more than any words could have, and lifted out a single folded paper, brown with age and creased along lines gone soft as cloth. "My mother's bread recipe," she said, to no one in particular, though Jasper understood she was saying it to steady herself as much as to inform him. "She wrote it out the year she married my father and carried it from Ohio to Montana in a Bible she was not otherwise much given to reading. She has been gone 4 years now, and my father 4 months, and this post is the only thing left standing of the life either of them built. I did not come here to lose it to a man who sends letters instead of coming to look me in the eye." Jasper said nothing for a long moment. Then, because it was the only true thing he had to offer, he said, "Whatever else Elias Crane means to do, ma'am, he will have to do it knowing I am not going anywhere just yet." Jane looked at him with an expression he could not entirely read: gratitude, wariness, and something else beneath both of those, and said only, "We will see how long that holds, Mr. Stone. Men make promises easily in the daylight." It was not quite trust, but it was not quite refusal either, and Jasper found that he could live with that for now. He stayed 3 days at Ramsey's post, ostensibly to see Silas Cobb's leg through its first dangerous stretch of healing, and to help Whitfield with repairs the old clerk's back could no longer manage alone. In truth, he stayed because he found himself unwilling to ride back to his solitary cabin and leave Jane Ramsey to face Elias Crane's coming hearing with nothing but an aging clerk and a hobbled teamster at her side. On the second evening, he found her standing in the post's kitchen before the old clay oven built into the chimney's base, her mother's recipe unfolded in her hand, her face tight with a frustration she was trying and failing to hide. "Something wrong?" he asked from the doorway. "Everything is wrong with this oven," she said, not turning. "It was built for my father's cook, who wanted heat and did not care about evenness, and it scorches on one side and leaves the other raw. My mother's recipe calls for a slow, steady heat all the way around the loaf, the kind you get from a proper domed oven with the fire built up and raked out before the bread goes in. This, she gestured at the lopsided brick opening. This will never give me that, not if I fought with it every day for a year. Why does it matter so much? Whitfield tells me the post sells flour and coffee and traps, not loaves. She turned to look at him then, and there was something raw in her face that he had not seen there before, not even when Sela's cob had been bleeding on the creek bank. Because bread was the one thing my mother could make that tasted like home no matter where we were living, and we lived in 6 different places before she died. Because if I can make her bread properly, in a proper oven, then something of her survives here besides a name on a deed. And because she stopped, color rising in her cheeks as if she had said more than she intended. Because a trading post that sells fresh bread to every traveler crossing the pass does better business than one that sells only dry goods, Jasper finished for her gently. She let out a breath that was almost a laugh. Yes, that too. I am not above being practical, Mr. Stone. He studied the old oven for a long moment, turning something over in his mind the way he might study a stretch of unfamiliar river before committing a boat to it. I've built ovens before, he said finally. Not fine ones, but sound ones. There's clay along the creek bank not 2 miles from here, good tight clay that'll hold heat the way you need it to, and stone enough in that old rock slide above the corral to build a proper base. Give me a week, and I believe I could build you something that would do your mother's recipe justice. Jane looked at him for a long moment, searching his face for whatever it was she needed to find there. Why would you do that, Mr. Stone? You already pulled Sela's out of that creek. You already gave up your medicine and your window, and 3 days you could have spent on your own business, whatever that is. My business is guiding folks down dangerous water when they're fool enough to pay me for it, which is not often this time of year with the rivers running the way they are. He shrugged, though the gesture cost him more than it appeared to, because the truth sitting beneath it was harder to say than the joke covering it. I suppose I have not had much reason in a long while to build something instead of just surviving another season. Let me build you your oven, Miss Ramsey. Consider it payment for the window. She almost smiled then, the first real almost smile he had seen on her, and said, That was a very cheap window, Mr. Stone. It was a very good bit of bread, from what Whitfield tells me your mother used to make. It took him 9 days, not 7, working from dawn until the light failed each evening, hauling stone from the old slide on a sledge he built himself, mixing clay with sand and straw the way his own grandmother, half a lifetime and 1,000 miles from Montana, had once shown a much younger Jasper Stone to do, before he had learned rivers instead of hearths. Jane worked alongside him more often than not, mixing mortar, fetching water, and once, memorably, correcting the angle of the flue with a confidence that told him she had watched such work done before and remembered every detail of it. They talked in those 9 days, more than either of them seemed to expect. She told him about her mother, a schoolteacher's daughter from Ohio who had married a trader and followed him west with nothing but her Bible, her needle case, and an unshakable conviction that a decent loaf of bread could make any strange place feel like home. She told him about her father, a good man but a poor businessman, generous to every drifter who came through his door and careless about who owed him what. She told him, carefully, guardedly, about the years of moving from post to post before her father finally settled at the base of Maria's Pass, and about learning to sew and to cook and to keep books all before she was 15, because someone in the family needed to know how. He told her less. He told her he had grown up on the Ohio River before his family had come west, that he had learned water the way other men learned scripture, reading its moods and its dangers until the reading became instinct. He told her he had guided wealthy Easterners down the Missouri and the Yellowstone for the better part of 10 years. He did not tell her why he had stopped, and when she asked once gently on the 7th evening, as they sat by the fire watching the mortar cure on the half-finished oven, he only said, "That's a longer story than we have daylight for tonight." And she, to his relief and his shame both, did not push. On the 9th day the oven stood finished, a squat, sturdy dome of stone and fired clay, its mouth faced with brick salvaged from the old chimney, its flue drawing clean and true when he lit the first curring fire inside it. Jane stood before it with her mother's recipe in her hand and something like awe on her face. "It's beautiful," she said. "It's the most beautiful thing anyone has ever built for me. Let's see if it bakes as good as it looks before you go handing out compliments," Jasper said, though the words in his chest were nothing so gruff as the ones that came out of his mouth. She built the fire the way the recipe, and some instinct passed down from her mother, told her to a hot blaze first, to heat the stone through, then rake to the sides once the dome had gone from black to gray to a pale, even ash white that told her the heat was ready. She mixed the dough with a care that bordered on reverence, her hands moving through motions she had clearly performed 1,000 times, kneading, folding, waiting, and Jasper found himself unable to look away from the quiet devotion in her face as she worked. The loaves went in as the sun was setting, and for the better part of an hour the whole post smelled of wood smoke and yeast, and something warmer than either. And when Jane finally drew the bread out on a long wooden paddle, its crust a deep golden brown, its top split just so along a scored line she had cut before baking, she stood holding it for a long moment before she could bring herself to cut it. She gave Jasper the first slice, still too hot to hold comfortably, and watched his face while he ate it. He had eaten a great many things in his life, cooked over a great many fires, and he would have told anyone who asked that he had no particular gift for noticing what made one loaf of bread different from another. But this dense and light at once, the crust shattering under his teeth, the inside soft and faintly sweet with something he could not name, this tasted, he thought, the way he imagined a real home might taste if he had ever had the chance to know one long enough to remember it. "Well?" Jane asked, and for the first time since he had met her, she sounded uncertain. "Your mother," Jasper said slowly, "sounds like she was a fine woman." Jane's eyes went bright and she looked away toward the fire for a moment before she trusted herself to speak. "Thank you, Mr. Stone," she said, "for the oven and for saying that." "Jasper," he said, "I think we've earned first names after 9 days of clay and stone." "Jasper," she repeated, testing the shape of it, and something in the way she said it settled into him like a stone dropping into deep water, sure and lasting and impossible to call back. Word of the bread traveled faster than either of them expected. Within 2 weeks, teamsters and trappers and the rare traveling family crossing toward the goldfields beyond the pass were stopping at Ramsey's post not for flour or nails, but for a loaf of Jane Ramsey's bread, still warm from the new oven, wrapped in cloth for the road. Whitfield's ledgers, which had shown only losses for months, began to show, for the first time since Jane's father's death, small but real gains. Sila's cob, his leg healing clean thanks to Jane's stitching, hobbled about on a crutch tending the store while Jane baked, and even he remarked more than once that he had never seen a post come back to life so fast. It was this, the sound of real prosperity, however modest, that brought Elias Crane riding up the valley road on a fine gray gelding, dressed in a town coat too fine for the country he was riding through, 10 days before the hearing was set to begin. Jasper was splitting firewood behind the barn when Crane arrived, and he watched from a distance as the man dismounted, straightened his coat, and mounted the porch steps with the easy confidence of someone who believed the ground beneath him already belonged to him. "Jane," Crane said, spreading his hands in a gesture of warmth that did not reach his eyes, "you look well. Better than I expected, given the reports I've had of hardship on the road. I've managed, Mr. Crane, as I told you I would in my letter. So I hear. The whole valley is talking about your bread." He said the word bread the way another man might say a child's toy, indulgent and faintly dismissive. "Charming, truly. But bread does not pay a note of $400, Jane, and that is what your father owed against this post when he died. A note I have been carrying on your behalf out of nothing but old friendship and love for your father's memory." Whitfield's ledgers show the debt at closer to 200, Jane said evenly, and most of that already paid down before Father died. I have been through the books myself. Something flickered behind Crane's eyes, surprise, quickly smoothed over. Then Whitfield's books are wrong, my dear, which is precisely the kind of confusion I have been trying to spare you. This is exactly why the court must weigh in. A young woman alone, however clever with a needle or an oven, cannot be expected to untangle the business affairs of a working post, especially one so deep in debt as this. I am not alone, Jane said, and though her voice did not rise, there was steel beneath it that made Crane's smile falter for just a moment. And I do not intend to be found incompetent by a court simply because you have decided it is convenient for me to be. Crane's gaze slid then toward Jasper, who had set down his axe and come around the corner of the barn without quite meaning to, drawn by something in Jane's tone that told him she might need to know he was near. And this, Crane said, would be the mountain man I have heard mentioned. Stone, is it? Building ovens for young ladies now, I understand, when you are not off drowning wealthy tourists on the Missouri. The words landed like a slap, and Jasper felt something old and cold rise up in him, a memory he had spent 11 years trying to bury under solitude and hard work. He said nothing. He had learned over those 11 years that saying nothing was safer than saying anything at all when a man aimed for that particular wound. I see you know each other's history better than I do, Jane said, looking between them, her sharp eyes catching the tension though not yet its cause. Ask him yourself sometime what happened to young Mr. Prout on the Yellowstone in the year 74, Crane said lightly, already turning back toward his horse. I am sure he will tell you all about it, if he is as honest a man as he seems to want you to believe. He mounted, gathered his reins, and looked back once more at Jane. The hearing is in 10 days, my dear. I would advise you to spend them consulting a lawyer rather than a baker's oven. He rode off down the valley road, and Jane turned to Jasper with a question already forming on her lips, but something in his face, closed, gray, and far away, made her hold it back. You don't have to tell me, she said quietly. Not now, not until you're ready. Thank you, he said, and though the gratitude was real, so was the shame beneath it, and both of them knew, without saying so, that the question had only been postponed, not answered. The crisis, when it came, arrived not from Elias Crane but from the mountains themselves. 10 days before the hearing was to open in the small courthouse at Chodau. A hard, fast rain fell for 2 days straight in the high country above the pass, and on the third morning Jasper woke in the small cabin he had built for himself a stone's throw from the post. He had taken to staying nearby now, unwilling to leave Jane, and the post undefended so close to the hearing. To a sound he knew better than any other sound in the world, the low, growing roar of water gathering itself for violence. He was at the post within minutes and found Jane already on the porch, staring up the valley road where Badger Creek, normally a placid ribbon this far from the mountains, had swollen into a brown torrent that had already begun eating at the near bank not 50 yards from the barn. Silas is out checking the corral fence, she said, her voice tight. He went before the water started rising this bad. I told him to hurry back, but that was near half an hour ago. Jasper was already moving, his eyes doing the reading they always did, tracing the water's rise, the angle of the current where it bent hard against the low ground near the corral, the exact spot where a man on a bad leg would find himself trapped if the water came up faster than he expected. Get rope, he told Jane. All you have. And get Whitfield to bring the wagon up to solid ground, away from the bank. He ran down the slope toward the corral, and there, exactly where his instinct had told him to look, he found Silas Cobb waist-deep in rising water, his splinted leg buckled beneath him where he had slipped on the mud, one hand clinging to a fence post that was beginning, visibly, to lean under the pressure of the current. "Hold on," Jasper shouted, and waded in at the angle the water allowed, feeling the ground shift treacherously beneath his boots even as he found, by instinct more than sight, the firmer footing a few feet to the left. He reached Sela's just as the fence post gave way entirely, and for one long, terrible moment both men went under together, the current dragging at them with a strength that even Jasper's long experience had not fully prepared him for. He came up gasping, Silas's collar still fisted in one hand, and struck out for the bank with every ounce of strength his years on rivers had built into him, fighting a current that seemed determined to pull them both toward the deep, churning water where the creek narrowed downstream. He felt his boot heel catch a submerged root, and used it to launch them both another few feet closer to the bank, close enough now that he could see Jane running along the shore toward them with a coil of rope already looped and ready in her hands, exactly the way he had asked. "Here," she called, and threw the rope with a strong, sure arm that told him she had done this before, or at least practiced the throw enough times to make it count. It landed close enough for him to catch on the second try, and he looped it fast around Silas's chest and shouted for her to pull. She did not pull alone. Whitfield, appearing at her shoulder despite his age, threw his weight into the rope beside her, and between the two of them they dragged Silas's cob up onto the bank, coughing water but alive, while Jasper fought the last few yards on his own strength, finally hauling himself onto solid ground just as a wave of debris, a whole uprooted cottonwood, torn loose somewhere upstream, went thundering past the spot where he had been standing not 30 seconds before. For a long moment, no one spoke. Silas lay on the bank, breathing hard, alive. Whitfield knelt beside him, checking for injury. And Jane Ramsey stood over Jasper Stone, who had collapsed to his knees in the mud, his chest heaving. A long gash opened along his forearm where the cottonwood's branches had caught him as it swept past. "You're bleeding," she said, and her voice cracked on the words in a way it had not cracked once during the whole ordeal of Silas's rescue. "It's not deep," Jasper managed. "That is for me to decide, not you." She was already pulling her needle case from her belt, the same one she had used on Silas that first day at the creek, and her hands, though they trembled slightly now that the danger had passed, were as sure as ever as she cleaned the wound and began to close it. "You didn't have to throw yourself into rescuing me," Jasper said, watching her face as she worked, close enough now that he could see the fine lines of concentration at the corners of her eyes, the small scar at her jaw he had never noticed before. "You didn't have to throw yourself into that water for Silas," she said without looking up. "I don't recall either of us asking permission from the other before we decided to be brave." "Fair enough." She tied off the last stitch and sat back on her heels, and for a moment neither of them moved, the rain still falling around them, the creek still roaring below, Silas and Whitfield already making their way back up toward the post's shelter, leaving the two of them alone on the muddy bank in a silence that had suddenly grown very charged. "I thought you were going to die," Jane said quietly. "For one moment, when the water took you both under, I thought I was going to watch you die, and I have never in my life been so afraid of anything." "I've been in worse water than that," Jasper said, though the words came out gentler than he intended. "That is not the point, Jasper." She looked up at him then, rain streaking down her face, and whatever careful distance she had been keeping between them for the past 3 weeks seemed, in that moment, to simply dissolve. "The point is that I did not want to lose you. I have known you 3 weeks and I did not want to lose you, and I do not entirely know what to do with that." He reached out slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, and brushed a strand of wet hair back from her face. "I don't know what to do with it either," he admitted. "I gave up expecting to feel anything like this a long time ago." "Why?" she asked, and this time it was not a question she let slide past unanswered. "Why did you give up, Jasper?" "What happened on the Yellowstone in '74. He should have told her then. He knew it even as he hesitated, even as the old shame rose up in his throat and closed around the words before he could speak them. Instead, he did the only other thing he could think to do, the thing that had been building in him since the day he watched her stitch a wound by a flooding creek with more courage than most men he had guided ever showed. He leaned down and kissed her. She went still for one heartbeat, and then her hand came up to rest against his chest, not pushing him away but holding on, and she kissed him back with a fierceness that matched everything he had already come to know about her. No hesitation once she had decided a thing was right, no half measures. When they finally broke apart, both of them breathing unsteadily, rain still falling around them, Jane rested her forehead against his and said, "That does not answer my question." "No," he agreed. "It doesn't. I need you to answer it, Jasper. Not today if today is too soon, but before the hearing. Because Elias Crane already knows the answer, and he is going to use it against you and against me by extension if I let you stand beside me in that courtroom without knowing what he's holding over your head." "You're right," Jasper said, and the admission cost him more than the kiss had given him. "I'll tell you. I promise you that. Just not tonight. Tonight I want to remember this instead." Jane studied him a moment longer, and then, because she was not a woman who demanded more than a person could give in a single moment, she nodded. "Tonight, then," she said. "But soon." He told her 3 nights later, sitting by the fire in the post's main room after Whitfield and Silas had gone to bed, the two of them alone with the low crackle of the flames, and the last of the rain still tapping against the roof. "In the summer of '74, he began, "I was guiding a party of 4 down the Yellowstone for a mining company out of Bozeman, men who wanted to survey a stretch of river for a proposed flume. There was a young man among them, Thomas Prout, not more than 19, the nephew of the company's president, sent along because his uncle wanted him to learn the business from the ground up. He had never run whitewater in his life, and I told his uncle before we set out that the boy had no business in a boat on that stretch of river until he'd had proper training. His uncle told me he was paying me to guide, not to lecture, and if I couldn't manage a boat with an inexperienced man aboard, then perhaps I wasn't the guide he'd been told I was." Jane said nothing, only watched him, her hands still in her lap. "I should have refused," Jasper went on, his voice gone low and rough. "I've told myself that every day for 11 years. I should have told that man to find another guide, or left the boy on the bank, or done anything other than what I did, which was let pride talk me into proving I could handle it. We hit a stretch of rapids I knew was dangerous, and I misjudged it not by much but by enough, and the boat rolled. Thomas Prout went under and did not come back up. I dove for him 3 times. I found him the 3rd time, but by then it was too late to bring him back." "Jasper," Jane said softly, but he shook his head, needing to finish now that he had started. "There was an inquest. I was cleared of wrongdoing. The current in that stretch had shifted since the last time anyone had charted it, and the coroner's jury found it an accident, not negligence. But I knew the truth even if the law didn't want to look at it too closely. I knew I had let a rich man's pride push me into a decision I would never have made on my own judgment, and a boy had died for it. I started drinking after that, more than I should have, and 2 years later, guiding a different party on a different river while I was not entirely sober, I came within a hair of losing a second man the same way. That was the day I quit guiding for good, moved up into the high country, and told myself I had no business being trusted with anyone's life or anyone's trust again." The fire popped and settled. Jane was quiet for a long moment, and Jasper braced himself for whatever judgment was coming, certain, in the old familiar way, that this was the moment she would decide he was not the man she had thought him to be. "You pulled Silas Cobb out of a flooding creek 3 days ago," she said finally. "You did not hesitate. You did not let pride push you into the water. You went in because it was the right thing to do, and you read that water as carefully as any man could have, and you brought him out alive. That is not the same man who made a mistake 11 years ago because someone else's pride overruled his judgment. Crane doesn't see it that way. Neither will half the county, once he starts telling the story his way." "Then we will tell it my way," Jane said, and there was steel in her voice now, the same steel he had heard the first night she stood at his broken window demanding his medicine tin. "The whole truth, Jasper, not the half of it Crane wants to weaponize. You told me. You didn't wait for him to force it out of you, or for me to find it out some other way. That matters more to me than what happened on a river before I was even old enough to know you existed. You're not afraid of what I am. I require honesty, Jasper Stone. I have required it my whole life, because I have watched too many people twist the truth to suit themselves, my father's debts hidden from me until it was nearly too late. Elias Crane's smiling face over a knife he means to put in my back. You gave me the truth before I even had to ask twice. That is not nothing. That is, in fact, very nearly everything. He reached for her hand across the small space between their chairs, and she let him take it, her fingers lacing through his with a certainty that steadied something in him that had been unsteady for 11 long years. I am still afraid of that courtroom, he admitted. So am I, Jane said. But we will walk into it together, and whatever Elias Crane says about either of us, we will have told the truth first, and that has to count for something in front of a fair judge. The trouble was that they would not get the chance, not in the way either of them expected. 5 days before the hearing, Whitfield rode into the post yard on the post's one remaining sound horse, his face gray and his hands shaking on the reins, with news that changed the shape of everything. "They've arrested me," he said, before he had even fully dismounted. "Or they mean to. A deputy came to the store in Chodau not 2 hours ago with a warrant sworn out by Elias Crane himself, claiming I falsified the post's ledgers to hide embezzlement on your father's behalf, Miss Ramsey. I only got clear because old Mrs. Halloran warned me the deputy was asking after my whereabouts before he'd even served the paper." "That's absurd," Jane said. "Those ledgers are the only honest accounting this post has had in years. Crane's the one who's been skimming, not you. I know that, and you know that, but the warrant doesn't care what's true, only what a judge signs. And Miss Ramsey, the worst of it is the timing. If they take me into custody and hold me at the county jail in Fort Benton until after your hearing, I cannot testify about the real state of the accounts. Crane's lawyer can stand up before the judge and say the books are unreliable, that their keeper is a fugitive from a fraud charge, and there will be no one left to contradict him." Jasper felt the old cold calculation settle over him, the same clarity that came over him reading Dangerous Water. "How are they planning to move you?" "I heard the deputy mention a prison wagon coming through from Chodau day after tomorrow, headed for the territorial jail at Fort Benton by way of the Low Pass Road, since the High Pass is still running too much snowmelt for a wagon to risk. If they catch me before then, that's how I'll travel." "Then we make sure they don't catch you before then," Jane said, already moving toward the small writing desk in the corner of the post's main room. "And we make sure that if they do put you on that wagon, we are there to take you off it with something stronger than our word alone." "What do you have in mind?" Jasper asked. "Judge Marcus Bell rides the circuit that includes both Chodau and Fort Benton," Jane said, pulling paper and ink toward her. "My father corresponded with him twice over boundary disputes years ago, and always found him scrupulously fair. If we can reach him before that wagon reaches Fort Benton, and lay the truth before him, Crane's fraudulent warrant, the real ledgers, everything, he can issue a writ ordering Whitfield released into the court's custody to testify at my hearing instead of rotting in a cell while Crane's lies go unanswered." "Judge Bell," Jasper repeated slowly. "That's the same judge who presided over the inquest after Thomas Prout drowned." Jane looked up at him. "Does that trouble you?" "It should trouble me more than it does," Jasper admitted. "But if he's as fair a man as you say, then maybe that's exactly the kind of judge this county needs looking at Crane's warrant too." They rode through the night to reach Judge Bell at the small circuit courthouse in Chodau, arriving road-weary and mud-splattered just as the judge, a spare, silver-haired man with tired but sharp eyes, was preparing to ride out himself toward his next stop. Jane laid out the whole matter before him with a clarity and composure that Jasper, watching her, found himself admiring more with every sentence. The debts overstated, the ledgers Whitfield had faithfully kept, the sudden and suspiciously timed warrant against the one man who could prove Crane's fraud. Judge Bell listened without interruption, then studied the ledger pages Jane had brought with her for a long, careful 10 minutes before he finally looked up. "I have known Elias Crane for near 20 years," he said slowly. "I would not have thought him capable of this, though I confess I have long thought him overfond of his own advantage. Miss Ramsey, I cannot simply dismiss a warrant sworn before another magistrate on your word alone, however convincing. But I can issue a writ of habeas corpus, directing that Mr. Whitfield, once in custody, be brought before this court rather than confined at Fort Benton, on the grounds that his testimony is material to a matter already pending before me. If you can deliver that writ to whoever is holding him before that wagon crosses into the next county, the law will be on your side rather than Crane's." "And if we cannot reach the wagon in time?" Jasper asked. The judge's eyes moved to him then, and something flickered in them, recognition, perhaps, or memory. "Then Mr. Whitfield spends a great many uncomfortable weeks in the territorial jail before this matter can be untangled through slower channels, and Miss Ramsey's hearing goes forward without her strongest witness. I would advise you not to let that happen, Mr. Stone. I remember your name from an inquest 11 years past. I remember, too, that the coroner's jury found you blameless, whatever you may have told yourself since. A man who has spent a decade punishing himself for one bad piece of luck on a river strikes me as exactly the sort of man who might now ride hard enough and think clearly enough to catch a wagon before it crosses a county line." He signed the writ, sealed it, and pressed it into Jane's hands. "The low pass road follows the river most of its length and crosses it twice, once at Sweetgrass Ford and once near the old mill. If Whitfield left Chodal this morning as your information suggests, and if the wagon is making the usual time, you might catch them at Sweetgrass Ford by tomorrow midday, provided you do not waste the daylight you have remaining." They rode out within the hour, pushing their horses harder than either animal wanted to be pushed, stopping only long enough to rest them for a few hours in the deep dark before dawn, and were back in the saddle before the sky had fully lightened, following the low pass road as it wound down out of the foothills toward the river. They caught sight of the prison wagon a little after noon, exactly where Judge Bell had predicted, drawn up at the near bank of Sweetgrass Ford while the deputy driving it, a heavy-set man Jasper recognized from Crane's earlier visit, one of the hired hands who did errands too dirty for Crane's own soft hands, argued with a second rider, clearly debating whether the ford was safe to cross. The river at Sweetgrass Ford ran high and fast with the same snowmelt that had nearly taken Sela's Cobb and Jasper both, and Jasper's trained eye read the danger in it immediately. A deceptive channel of smooth water masking a drop where the riverbed shelved away sharply, exactly the kind of crossing that had claimed wagons and lives before. "They're going to try it," Jasper said, watching the deputy gather his reins. "That ford is not safe for a loaded wagon, not today, not with the water this high." "We have to stop them before they try it," Jane said. "Whitfield's chained inside that wagon, if it goes over." They spurred their horses down the last stretch of trail and reached the ford just as the deputy urged his team forward into the water, the wagon lurching down the bank with Whitfield's pale, frightened face visible through the small barred window at its rear. "Stop!" Jasper shouted, his voice carrying across the water with the same authority it had carried across 100 rapids in his guiding years. "That ford will roll your wagon before you're halfway across. There's a drop-off dead center you cannot see from the bank." The deputy, a man named Hobbs, twisted in his seat, scowling at the sight of a stranger, and a woman bearing down on him at a gallop. "This ain't your business, mister." "Get back or I'll—" "It is very much my business," Jane called, holding the sealed writ high enough for him to see the judge's ribbon and wax seal even at a distance. "This is a writ signed by Judge Marcus Bell of the Territorial Circuit Court, directing that your prisoner be delivered to his custody, not to Fort Benton. You have no lawful authority to carry that man 1 foot further, and if you drown him trying to prove otherwise, you will answer for it in front of the same judge." Hobbs hesitated, his team already up to their knees in the churning water, the wagon's wheels beginning to slide sideways on the shifting gravel beneath them, exactly as Jasper had warned. "Turn them back toward the bank now," Jasper shouted, already spurring his horse into the shallows, reading the water even as he moved, calculating the exact line that would let him reach the lead horses before the current pulled the whole rig into the drop-off he had seen from shore. "You're 2 strides from losing this whole wagon into water that'll roll it twice before it settles." Whether it was the authority in Jasper's voice, the sight of Jane's sealed writ, or simple self-preservation, Hobbs hauled hard on his reins and fought his team back toward the bank they had just left, the wagon groaning and shuddering as its wheels caught and slid on the loose gravel, one wheel lifting alarmingly before the whole rig lurched free of the current's worst pull and came to rest, canted but upright, back on solid ground. For a moment, everyone on that riverbank simply breathed. Then Hobbs, recovering some of his bluster now that the immediate danger had passed, climbed down from his seat and squared up in front of Jane. "That paper don't mean nothing to me, lady. I got my orders from a sworn warrant, and I mean to carry them out." "A sworn warrant that a circuit judge has now superseded," Jane said, her voice steady despite the pounding of her heart, which Jasper could see in the pulse at her throat even from where he sat his horse. "Read it yourself, if you can read, or ride back to Chotao and ask Judge Bell to explain it to you in smaller words, but either way, you are not taking this man to Fort Benton today." It was, in the end, not the writ alone that settled the matter, nor the standoff between Jasper Stone and a deputy who had just nearly drowned his own prisoner through carelessness, but the arrival, 20 minutes later, of a second party of riders coming down the low pass road behind them, a territorial marshal, summoned by Judge Bell himself before they had even left Chodao, sent to see the writ properly served with the full weight of the law behind it should Hobbs prove stubborn. Faced with a marshal's badge and a judge's seal both, Hobbs's resistance collapsed entirely. Whitfield was unlocked from the wagon's rear compartment, pale and shaken but unharmed, and delivered into the marshal's custody to be escorted, this time properly, toward Judge Bell's court to await the hearing rather than toward a jail cell in Fort Benton. "You saved my life twice in 1 month between the two of you," Whitfield said hoarsely, once he had been helped down and given water. "I do not know how I will ever repay either of you." "Testify," Jane said simply. "Tell the truth in front of Judge Bell about those ledgers, and about Elias Crane's part in all of this, and that will be repayment enough." They rode back toward Chotao at a slower pace than they had come, the immediate danger past, the marshal and his prisoner ahead of them on the road, and it was during that quieter ride, side by side, their horses walking now instead of galloping, that Jane finally turned to Jasper with something like wonder in her face. "You read that water the moment you saw it," she said. "You knew exactly where the danger was before Hobbs's wagon ever touched the current." "It's the one thing I never stopped being good at," Jasper said, "even after I stopped trusting myself to use it for anything but staying alone in the mountains. You used it today to save a man's life. Not because anyone paid you to, and not because pride pushed you into it, because it was right and because you could." She reached across the small space between their horses and took his hand. "I think, Jasper Stone, that you have spent 11 years punishing a man who doesn't exist anymore, if he ever did the way you remember him." He held her hand the rest of the way back to Chodao, and though the words did not come easily, he found himself, for the first time in over a decade, believing that she might be right. The hearing convened 6 days later in the small, sun-warmed courthouse at Chodao, its single room packed with more spectators than Jasper had ever seen gathered in one place in the high country. Trappers and traders and homesteaders who had, in the space of 2 months, come to know Jane Ramsey's bread and, through it, Jane Ramsey herself. Elias Crane's lawyer opened with exactly the argument they had expected, that a young, unmarried woman of no formal business training could not reasonably be expected to manage a trading post burdened with debt, that her judgment was suspect, her chief supporter a man with a documented history of fatal negligence on the river, and her clerk a fugitive from a fraud warrant whose testimony could not be trusted. Judge Bell heard it all with the same patient, unreadable attention he had shown Jane in his chambers, and then invited Whitfield to the stand. The old clerk, restored now to something like his usual dignity, laid out the post's true accounts with a precision that left no room for doubt. The debt overstated by more than half in Crane's filings. Payments Jane's father had made in the last year of his life conveniently omitted from Crane's version of the ledgers. And a pattern, traceable across 3 years of entries, of funds diverted from the post's accounts into a ledger book of Crane's own keeping, one that Whitfield, anticipating exactly this fight, had quietly copied and hidden before Crane's men could seize the originals. When Crane's lawyer attempted to discredit the testimony by pointing to the fraud warrant still technically pending against Whitfield, Judge Bell himself interjected dryly that a warrant obtained through what now appeared to be Elias Crane's own perjured complaint carried considerably less weight than the ledgers it had been sworn out to suppress. Jane took the stand next and spoke plainly about the post's recovery in the weeks since her arrival, the debts paid down, the new trade the bread had brought in, the repairs completed, the accounts she had kept current and honest with her own hand every single day. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. The steady, unflinching competence in every word she spoke did more to answer Crane's accusations than any objection her own hastily hired lawyer might have raised. Then it was Jasper's turn, and he walked to the stand with his heart hammering harder than it had in the flood water at Sweetgrass Ford, aware of every eye in the room, aware most of all of Jane's eyes on him, steady and warm and unafraid. Crane's lawyer wasted no time. "Mr. Stone, is it true that in the year 1874, a young man named Thomas Prout drowned while under your guidance on the Yellowstone River?" "It is true," Jasper said. His voice did not shake, though it cost him something to keep it steady. "And is it not true that you have, since that time, largely withdrawn from society, living alone in the mountains, unable or unwilling to trust yourself with the safety of others?" "That was true, yes, for 11 years. Jasper looked past the lawyer toward the judge and then deliberately toward Jane. "I let a rich man's pride push me into a decision I knew was wrong, and a boy died because of it. I have never once denied that, and I never will. I spent 11 years believing that meant I had no business being trusted with anything again. Not a boat, not a friendship, not a single soul's safety. And yet you now stand here, asking this court to trust your judgment on Miss Ramsey's behalf." "I stand here," Jasper said, "because 5 days ago I read a river the way I've read 100 rivers before, and I stopped a wagon from rolling into water that would have drowned an innocent man, the same way it drowned Thomas Prout 11 years ago. The difference this time is that I did not let anyone's pride, mine or anyone else's, override what I knew to be true. Miss Ramsey does not need my trust to be worthy of yours, Your Honor. She has proven that with her own hands, in her own ledgers, and in the bread she bakes fresh every morning for every soul who crosses that pass. But if my history matters to this court, then let it matter as the whole of it, a man who made one terrible mistake young, and has spent every day since trying to be worth more than that mistake. I believe, standing here today, that I finally am." The courtroom was very quiet when he stepped down. Judge Bell said nothing for a long moment, studying the papers before him, and then delivered his ruling with the same unhurried clarity he had brought to every part of the proceedings. He found that Elias Crane had knowingly misrepresented the post's debts, that the fraud warrant against Whitfield had been sworn in bad faith and was accordingly dismissed with prejudice, and that Jane Ramsey had demonstrated, through her own conduct and accounts, every capability the law required of an heir managing an inherited business. Her ownership of Ramsey's post was confirmed outright, free of any guardianship, effective immediately. Elias Crane, the judge noted further, would be answering separately, in a criminal proceeding to follow, for the matter of the falsified ledgers and the fraudulent warrant both. Crane, white-faced and silent, was led from the courthouse under the marshal's watch, his fine coat suddenly looking far too small for the man wearing it, and Jane Ramsey stood in the sunlit doorway of the Chodell courthouse with tears on her face that were, for once, entirely and only tears of relief. "It's over," she said, half to herself, half to Jasper, who had come to stand beside her. "It's really over. The post is mine, free and clear, and no one can take it from me now." "It was always going to be yours," Jasper said. "Crane just made the mistake of thinking you'd let him take it without a fight." She turned to him, and whatever formality had lingered between them through the weeks of danger and testimony seemed to dissolve entirely in the warm afternoon light. "You didn't have to say what you said up there, about the mistake you made, laid bare in front of the whole county." "I did, though," Jasper said. "You told me once that you require honesty before you offer trust. I decided somewhere on that riverbank at Sweetgrass Ford that I wanted your trust more than I wanted to keep hiding, whatever it cost me in front of a courtroom full of strangers. And what did it cost you?" "Less than I expected," he admitted, glancing around at the townsfolk still filing out of the courthouse, several of whom had clapped him on the shoulder on their way past, murmuring words of respect rather than judgment. "A great deal less than 11 years of carrying it alone ever cost me." They rode back to Ramsey's post together in the long gold light of early evening, Whitfield and Silas following behind in the wagon, and when they reached the post's yard, Jane went straight to the oven Jasper had built, still warm from that morning's baking, and stood before it for a long moment with her hand resting against its stone flank. "I want to ask you something," she said, "and I want you to answer honestly because that is the only way I know how to ask anything anymore." "Ask it. Now that Crane is finished and the post is safe, and I have no more debts and no more hearings hanging over me, will you still want to be here, building things and reading water for me instead of for wealthy men on the Yellowstone? Or was all of this only ever about seeing me through a crisis, the way a river guide sees a passenger through a rapid and then moves on to the next stretch of water?" Jasper crossed the yard to stand in front of her, close enough now that he could see every flicker of hope and fear crossing her face at once. "Jane Ramsey, I have spent 11 years alone in these mountains, telling myself I had no business wanting anything more than a cabin and a river and enough solitude to keep from hurting anyone else. Then a woman broke my window in the middle of the night to save a man's life, and every single thing I believed about myself started coming apart at the seams. I do not want to move on to the next stretch of water. I want to build the ferry crossing you'll need once this post starts drawing enough trade to warrant one. I want to guide the supply wagons up from Fort Benton when the regular road floods, the way it will every spring for the rest of both our lives. I want to wake up every morning to the smell of your mother's bread and fall asleep every night knowing you're safe beside me instead of 400 miles away wondering if I'll ever see you again." Jane's breath caught, and for a moment neither of them said anything at all, the evening settling gold and quiet around them, the oven stone still faintly warm beneath her hand. "That sounds," she said finally, her voice unsteady with something that was not fear, "very much like a proposal, Jasper Stone." "It's meant to be one," he said, and dropped, with a directness that made her laugh through the tears already gathering in her eyes, to one knee in the dust of the post's yard. "I don't have a ring. I've spent every dollar I own on stone and clay and rope in the last 2 months. But I have 2 strong hands, a cabin that could use a woman's touch, and a heart that has not felt this steady in 11 years. Jane Ramsey, will you marry me?" "Yes," she said, before he had even finished rising, pulling him up by both hands and into a kiss that held none of the uncertainty of the first one by the flooding creek, only a fierce, joyful certainty that neither of them tried to hide. "Yes, Jasper Stone, though I should warn you that I intend to keep baking bread and keeping books and running this post exactly as I please, husband or no husband. I would not have you any other way, Jasper said, laughing now, the sound of it rusty but real, like a door long unused finally swinging open on oiled hinges. "I only ask that you let me keep building things for you. Ovens, fairies, whatever this post needs to grow into everything your mother would have wanted it to be." They were married 3 weeks later, in a ceremony held in the post's yard beneath a sky so clear and blue it seemed to have been ordered specially for the occasion, with Whitfield standing as witness and Selah's cob, walking now without his crutch, giving Jane away in the absence of any family closer than the mountains themselves. Half the valley came, drawn as much by the promise of Jane's bread as by affection for the couple, and the tables groaned with more food than the post had seen in years. At the center of it, all a great golden loaf, baked that very morning in the oven Jasper had built with his own hands, its crust split along a line scored with the same careful precision Jane's mother had taught her, half a lifetime and 1,000 miles away. Elias Crane, tried the following autumn on charges of fraud and perjury, was convicted and sentenced to restitution, and a term in the territorial prison, his fine coats and his false friendship both stripped from him in the same courtroom where Jane had once faced her own reckoning. Ramsey's post, freed of his debts and his interference, grew over the following seasons into one of the most reliable stops on the road toward the pass, known as far as Fort Benton and Helena for two things in equal measure: the honest ledgers kept by its owner, and the bread that came, every single morning, warm and golden, from the oven a mountain man had built to match a dead woman's recipe, and in doing so had built himself a home he had long since stopped believing he deserved. Jasper never went back to guiding wealthy strangers down dangerous water for pay. But he built the ferry he had promised, and he guided the post's own supply wagons through every flood season that followed, reading currents that other men feared to attempt, always with the same steady confidence that had once, on a night of broken glass and desperate need, told a fierce and capable woman that he would not be going anywhere just yet. He kept that promise every day for the rest of both their lives.